Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 233 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. When we think about colonial American history, we tend to think about the colonies established by the English, the Dutch, the French, and even the Spanish. Rarely do we think about the colonies established by the Russians. And yet, Russia had colonies in North America. In fact, the story of Russian America is a very interesting one, because unlike the other European empires, which moved west across the Atlantic and then claimed territories along the east coast of North America and in the Caribbean, Russia expanded its imperial holdings by moving east across the Eurasian continent and by claiming territories along the west coast of North America. So, what does this story of Russian colonization look like? And do the practices and ideas of European colonization change when we view it in this Western context? Gwen Miller, an associate professor of history at the College of the Holy Cross, joins us to investigate a history of Russia's colonies in North America with details from her book, Kodiak Creole, Communities of Empire in Early Russian America. Now, as we view colonial America within the Russian colonial context, Gwen reveals why Russia chose to establish colonies in Alaska in 1784, the history of the Alutiiq people of Kodiak Island and the role they played in Russia's colonial ambitions, and details about the Russian fur trade and the important role it played in Russia's colonization of North America. But first, don't forget that we have two meetups this month. First, we'll meet in Albany, New York on Thursday, April 25th. I'll be giving a free public talk that evening at the New York State Cultural Education Center called A Visit to Ben Franklin's World. Then, on Monday, April 29th, we'll meet up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at Safiro's Pizza. Now, both events are free to attend, and I have details about these events and how to RSVP to them listed on the show notes page and in your Ben Franklin's World app. Okay, are you ready to venture forth into Russian America and into the early American history of Alaska? Let's go meet our guest historian. Our guest is an associate professor of history at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. She's an expert in the global connections of Native and early American history and on the history of Russia in early America. She's also written a book on these subjects, Kodiak Creole, Communities of Empire in Early Russian America. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Gwen Miller.
Thank you, Liz. I'm delighted to be here.
And we're so delighted you could join us, Gwen. So when we think about the history of Europeans and European empires in early America, we tend to think about the British, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, and all of their different attempts to colonize American territories. Yet, there were also other European countries and empires that tried to establish a foothold in North America, like Sweden and Russia. So Gwen, you've studied Russian attempts to colonize parts of North America, and I wonder if we could begin our conversation with having you tell us a bit about Russia's plan to establish colonies in North America.
Well, Liz, one of the things about this story is it's really all about the fur trade. It's a story that in many ways is familiar. It has many component parts that are similar to things that happen on the East Coast, but it actually comes at the end of a protracted and contiguous colonization of an entire continent. So it's the last phase of a long story of colonization for the Russian Empire. So it's different in that respect. And this is really driven by the growth of furs that fueled the entire Russian Empire. So the Muscovite Cossacks charged over the Urals in the 16th century, and they reached the Pacific by 1639, really all in search of furs. And so they continue not across the Bering Strait as we might expect, but actually gradually off the tip of Siberia, across the Aleutian Islands, and gradually come to Alaska. And they discover that there are furs there that are even more desirable than the furs that existed across the continent.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that colonizing North America was the last phase of the Russians' colonization plans. Where else did Russia establish, or at least plan to establish, colonies before they made their way to Alaska and the North American Pacific coast?
by the time of the colonization of Alaska, which happens in 1784, the official colonization anyway, of a permanent settlement, Russia has been moving out across the continent into what would be the continent of Eurasia, what would cover what we consider now 11 time zones. And so it was moving to the south. It was engaged with the Ottoman Empire. It was engaged with other European powers. It was engaged with the Chinese. So in all these different ways, there was a distinct Russian people, but it also encompassed lots and lots of different types of people, which would also inform the ideas about the peoples of Alaska.
Yeah, wow. I mean, it sounds like Russia had a global empire.
Definitely. And I think one thing that's distinctive about Russia, one of many things, is that when we think about other Europeans colonizing, we think about them moving out across oceans to colonize other peoples. And in this case, they gradually do this, the same thing, but it's very gradual along this continent.
Now, in your book, Kodiak Creole, you mentioned that you think historians have really understudied Russia's colonization of the Pacific Northwest. And I wonder if you would tell us why you think Russian America is such an understudied area.
There are a number of reasons. I think one thing is that this happens, as I said, the first permanent settlement is set up in 1784, and we know what else is going on at that time. It's the end of the American Revolution. So I think, our national narrative is so focused on that with good reason, but that has really eclipsed this other story. I think another piece is that Russia has and continues to be seen as something in between Europe and Asia, not really seen as a power that was competing with the English for the American continent. So that's part of the story. I think the Cold War might have something to do with it. During that period, not many Americans would have been very eager to hear that Russia had colonized what is now considered part of the U.S. for almost 100 years. And then there's also a question of sources, especially during the beginning phases of colonization, which I find are really interesting to think about how those are protracted story and not just a cataclysmic event. And kind of the limits of some of the sources have also made this understudied, I think.
Speaking of those sources, if you're a scholar or someone who has an interest in investigating aspects of Russian American history, what are the types of historical sources that we could look at, and where would we even find those sources?
Well, one of the things I love about this story is that it's fragmentary history. You have to take lots and lots of different bits and pieces of information from things like governmental decrees and reports, missionary records, early ethnographies and travel journals written by Russians, French, German, Spanish, English, and American adventurers, the writings of fur trade administrators, and then also reports of archaeological evidence and some oral histories as well. And so I think rather than taking something like the letters of Thomas Jefferson and trying to figure out what he was thinking through these very prolific writings, this story requires piecing together lots of different bits to try to create one narrative.
And it kind of sounds like you need many different languages in order to read these sources. I mean, how many different native languages and how many different European languages did you need to read these sources?
I think if I were starting this project now, I would definitely need to be more engaged with native languages, which I did not do when I started this project quite a long time ago now. But there are Russian documents at that time, which I actually learned Russian in order to do this project. So there are obviously challenges there, but there are some great English translations. So for instance, if a student or someone who's just interested in some of these documents wanted to think about Russian America, there are many great pieces that they could read. But I did read documents that were in Russian and French and in English for this.
Okay, why don't we see what kind of information these different documents reveal? So Gwen's book, Kodiak Creole, focuses specifically on the Russian history of Kodiak Island. Gwen, would you tell us something about Kodiak Island and what it was like before the Russians arrived there?
This is a very large island. It's approximately 100 miles long by 60 miles wide in some places. It's off the south coast of Alaska. It is the second largest island that's considered part of the U.S. after Hawaii. So it's a vast island. The environment is not like what we would typically think of Alaska. It's not igloos and snow and ice. It was a relatively lush and temperate island. The sea was really the way that people got sustenance, whether for clothing or for food. The range of the population was approximately 10,000 to 20,000 people living in this area before the Russians arrived. So there were trees on this island, unlike the Aleutians, which were not quite as hospitable. The Aleutians further to the west, that is. There were fruits. So there were lots of things available for people to survive on this island.
So who were these 10 to 20,000 people who lived on Kodiak Island, and what was their culture like?
So these are the Alutiiq-speaking people who lived on Kodiak. They shared a language with some people a little bit further to the north and east of them. They lived in small, semi-permanent villages. This was definitely a hierarchical society, not in the sense of a European class structure, but there were leading families. Men led these families. They were generally in charge of making decisions related to warfare, which they did conduct with other people in surrounding islands or along the coast. As I said, they lived in semi-permanent villages along the bays, which allowed them sustenance. During spawning season, they might camp along rivers to fish for salmon. Kayaks were really important in this culture because kayaks would allow people to go out into the water to hunt animals such as whales. And the whale hunt was very significant. There was all kinds of religious ceremony around hunting. And then they also hunted sea otters, which were unusual animals because their skins provided great warmth. But trade with others was significant. And they actually had glass and metal before they ever had direct contact with Europeans through this trade network. Children learned at a very young age. Young boys learned how to hunt sea otters. They learned boat construction. All the children learned how to process these animals and food preparation. So, by the time they were in their teens, they were really ready to help with the community. And there were very specific interdependent roles of men and women, prescribed gender roles within the society that they really relied on one another's work together in order to survive.
It really sounds like the Alutiiq people were very adept at both land and sea hunting, and they had a really well-established trade network. Could you tell us more about this network and what it was like? I mean, where did it extend, and how were the Alutiiq able to acquire things like glass and metal way before they ever met a European?
Well, in part because the Russians were coming from the West, right? They're coming in the opposite direction of the way we think of colonization in the Americas. And so some trade items had filtered through the Aleutians to them. As we know, trade items had filtered across the American continent for many native peoples even before they came in contact with Europeans. So in both directions, peoples in this area are receiving some elements of European trade.
Earlier, you noted that the Russians had made their way to the Aleutian Islands before they ever made their way to Kodiak Island. When and why did the Russians make their way to Kodiak Island? What brought them to Kodiak?
So Peter I, known as Peter the Great, was the ruler of Russia from the late 1600s to the early 1700s. And he was really interested in expanding the empire and also claiming land for the empire, engaging with what other Europeans had done. And so he sends the person whose name we know is associated with the Bering Strait. Vitus Bering is sent in the 1720s and then again in the 1740s to find out whether this land of America is connected to Russia, and also to see what resources might be available, and also to map the Pacific in the name of Russia. So there are two trips of Bering. In the second one, he dies, but Bering's expedition brings back these amazing furs. And these furs come to be something that are really the center of the interest in settling this area. But as I was saying before, the Russians, rather than just eventually cross the Bering Strait, they gradually grow from the tip of Siberia, where they have really used up quite a lot of the resources in the sable furs. And they go off the tip of Siberia and discover, once they get to the water, that these sea otters are there. And these sea otters, they also discover in the China trade, are quite valuable, more valuable than the Siberian sable. In the context of Peter the Great, the China trade had been opened up to Russia. And as we know, people around the world wanted to trade with China, even in this period. So one of the things about the sea otter is that is what, over the course of these islands, from the tip of Siberia gradually across, is what brings the Russians to Kodiak. And they finally set up a permanent settlement there in 1784. Some of the earlier Russians arrived there in the 1760s, and the native people there do not want them to settle permanently. They repel them. And Stepan Glotov brings back reports that the people here might not really want any settlement to go on. So there's a 20-year period between the 1760s and 1780s when a new company, and that is the company of Sholokhov, is able to get a new settlement going.
And now I'm really curious about the early interactions between the Russian traders who were looking for the sea otter and the Alutiiq people of Kodiak, because from your brief description, it doesn't really sound like these two peoples had positive relations with the other.
Well, one of the things is the way in which the Russians are trying to acquire these furs. So in Siberia, the Russian Empire has a tradition where representatives of the empire took hostages, the Cossacks took hostages and exacted fur in tribute. And this is different from the type of fur trade that we're familiar with in North America. So they take people hostage and they exact this yasak, this tribute. But alongside that, there were also private promyshleniki fur traders who were capturing the Siberian sable. Once they get to the waters off of Siberia and they discover the sea otters, they realize that they're really not adept at hunting these sea otters. They try, but they're not so good at obtaining them, but they're very lucrative, so they really want to obtain these furs. And so rather quickly, over the course of moving through the Aleutian Islands, which again are west of Kodiak, they realized that they're going to take some of the practices that the Russian Empire has put into place across the continent of hostage taking and encouraging native men to do work for them. So they start this practice in the islands off of Siberia into the Aleutians. And by the time they get to Kodiak, they do the same thing. They take native people hostage, children and women especially, and get the men who are so adept at hunting these sea otters to do the work for them.
Wow. That sounds like a really unpleasant way to conduct trade. So I guess if the Aleutians knew the Russians were coming, they wouldn't have necessarily wanted to trade with the Russians.
That's true. It was not a trade in the way we think of the fur trade between the Dutch and native peoples in the East at all. I call this an economy of confiscation. They're really forcing people to do work for them, which they're just not as skilled at. But this is the way the entire Russian fur trade then takes hold, right? The entire economy of this Russian American colony is based on this idea of hostage taking and extraction. Later on, leaders such as Catherine, who is an enlightened despot, who's, engaged with the ideas of the Enlightenment, says, well, you can't really do it this way. But then because they need the labor of native men, they can script them to do the work anyway.
As we talk about the fur trade, it occurs to me that we've talked about a couple of different fur-bearing animals, the sea otter and the sable. Could you talk to us a bit more about the Russians' different interest in these furs and what the different types of furs allowed them to do in the fur trade?
Yeah, so the sable furs were highly desired by many different Europeans and by people throughout Eurasia. So as the Russian government exacted those in tribute, that was really what built up the coffers of the empire, which allowed the empire to move across the continent in the first place. But what they soon found, even, in the time of Peter the Great, or soon thereafter, in the 1730s, Russians discovered that the desirability of the sea otter furs in the China market was so beyond that of sable furs that was the thing that they would focus on. The other thing about the sea otters is that they only produce one pup per year versus the sable, which produces 4. So they very quickly used up the resources. And this is what drove them through the Aleutian Islands so quickly to get them to Kodiak. So just in terms of thinking about the profitability of these, in the 1730s, one sea otter was worth 2 sable skins. And by 1775, it was worth many, many more. So by the time, of the American Revolution, these were incredibly lucrative furs in the China market.
Now, what exactly did it take to hunt sea otter? In your book, Kodiak Creole, it really sounded like it was hard to hunt these animals, and like the Aleutians must have developed skills to be more successful than most in terms of their ability to hunt them.
So what would happen is this was a collective effort. And before the Russians arrived, Aleutian people would go out to hunt these otters. These otters are very elusive. They even sleep in the water. So people would go out in 2 hatched kayaks together to hunt the sea otters. And they would, if they saw an otter, they would surround it. And then as it came to the surface, they would make signals to each other and one person would spear it and then it would dive down again. So they would have to keep reading the water to see where it might surface. So it was a difficult hunt. What happens is as the Russians realize they cannot do this on their own, they just don't have the skill, they start to take out flotillas of native men to do this hunting. But what they do is because they're using up the resources so quickly for this lucrative trade, they are taking them further and further away from their homes in conditions that they might not have gone out in otherwise. And so the population of native men is really being affected by this. And so are native peoples on the ground because the men who are usually there to help gain sustenance are not within the native villages.
Wow. It really sounds like this type of trade where you're taking the men further and further out from their villages was really disruptive to Native American life. do you have any more specifics you could share on how this type of hunt impacted native villages?
Well, so one of the things is that, and this is true in other fur trades, but one of the things is that because these resources were used up so quickly, and because native men were taken away for longer and longer periods of time, women and children had to do much of the work that men would have done within the community. So they had to also do some hunting. Women were processing the animals. And the other thing to note is that women were also working for the Russian Fur Trade Company in processing the animals. So they were having trouble being able just to support their own families as this trade takes off by the 1780s, 1790s.
Now, earlier you mentioned that it wasn't until the 1780s that the Russians began to establish permanent colonies in Alaska. And after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, I hope you'll tell us more about the Russians' move into Kodiak Island and their establishment of a permanent colony there. Enjoying our conversation with Gwen Miller? Her book, Kodiak Creole, documents a little studied time and place in early America, the convergence of Alutiiq and Russian cultures on Kodiak Island during the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, just as the Alutiiq people and the Russian fur traders were distinct communities, Ben Franklin's World is a unique community too. It's a community made up of awesome listeners just like you. And now, you'll be able to show the world that it's a community you're proud to be a part of. Because we have t-shirts. That's right. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/shop and you'll find a couple of great t-shirt designs. And if you have other items you'd like to see in the store, such as tote bags, ball hats, mugs, stickers, or even onesies, send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, and the Omohundro Institute and I will do our best to stock the items that you want to display your Ben Franklin's World pride. So visit benfranklinsworld.com/shop and order your new Ben Franklin's World t-shirt today. Gwen, we'd really love to know more about the colonies the Russians were planting in North America. So would you tell us about the Russians' move into Kodiak Island and their establishment of a permanent colony on that island?
This one Russian merchant leader, Shelikov, had an idea. One of the things about this period, Catherine II, or Catherine the Great, is the leader from 1762 until 1796. And she really wants to prove that Russia can be part of Western Europe. And one of the ideas that she seems to have, and some other elite Russians seems to have in the back of their mind, is that having a colony in North America is something that marks participation in Western Europe, is a marker of civilization in Western Europe. And she kind of, in part, sees Alaska as the last chance for Russians to be able to do this, right? It's the last part of North America that's up for grabs. Shelikov, on the other hand, is a merchant. He's from Siberia. He is not a noble person, but he sees the opportunity to set up a permanent colony is something that will obviously help his own reputation, but also it's very hard to supply these expeditions. And so the idea that a permanent colony can bring glory to Russia, but will also make the fur trade operate more smoothly. What he really wants is a monopoly, so there'll be less competition with others. So he thinks if he can have a year-round settlement, that will move this forward.
So when Shelikov brings this year-round settlement to Kodiak Island, what sorts of Russian traditions did these early colonists bring to the island, and what sorts of traditions did they create together with the Alutiiq people?
So one of the things that they do in setting up the colony is that the governor of Siberia, under whose auspices this new colony would be, sends crests of the empire and sends these directives that say you must place these crests anywhere that the Russians touch so that when any other Europeans might come, they'll see that we own this land. So claiming the land is a really important piece of this. That's something that we see with other European empires in the Americas. But they definitely have an idea, and there's a lot of imagining about the possibility of demonstrating Russian civility at this place. So they have an idea. They're going to build Russian-style buildings. Another really important piece of this colonization would be bringing missionaries. Now, they're not the Catholic or Protestant missionaries that we might be familiar with on the East Coast. They're Russian Orthodox missionaries. So, this is the reason that if you were to go to Southeast Alaska, you would see Russian Orthodox churches with their beautiful blue domes dotting the coast. So they bring these ideas, but they also bring ideas about interacting with native people. So they've encountered many different types of indigenous peoples in Siberia. And so they bring those notions to Russian America.
And what were the notions that they brought to Russian America? What were relations like between the new Russian colonists and the Alutiiq people who had lived in Kodiak for many, many, many years?
Well, one of the things that's distinct about this particular story is that many of the Russians who come are working peoples from the land in Siberia. The majority of them are kind of at the bottom of a Russian society. They're seen as Russian, they're Orthodox, but they've also been engaging with lots of different indigenous peoples over a long period of time. So it's not that they arrive in Alaska and then they are meeting these people for the first time. These people seem familiar to them. They might speak a different language from the Siberian indigenous peoples, but they already have an idea of engaging with these peoples. And so these fur traders were a dominated faction of a dominant society. And so they saw these native peoples as different from them, but they also were used to the idea of mixing with them because that is what happened in Siberia. So when they came, and when mostly men came, Russian men came, they formed unions with people from these native families. And they saw that as something rather fluid, not as something completely new.
Yeah, the gender imbalance of the Russian colonists is something that you highlight in Kodiak Creole too. And I wonder if you could say just a bit more about how this gender imbalance of the early Russian colonists would have impacted this early Russian colony and the Alutiiq people.
Well, I think the interdependent gender roles that I mentioned before on the island were completely thrown askew by the demands of the fur trade. So when native men were taken away for longer in periods of time, and the native peoples in the villages suffered, some native women chose, or their families chose, for them to form unions with native men. Now, you might ask why they would do this, but some families might have thought that they would receive better treatment if they formed these type of unions. I mean, they were used to forming unions through kinship. They did this with people from different villages, with some other group. So this would just fit into an idea, forming unions through kinship that would perhaps benefit a particular family. They might thought that they would have access to more resources. And in fact, the Russian leadership by the 1790s encouraged native men to marry native women because they thought that would be a way to grow a loyal population.
Speaking of these Russian and Alutiiq unions, you titled your book Kodiak Creole, Communities of Empire in Early Russian America. And I wonder if you would speak to us about the Creole part of your title. Who exactly did the Russians consider to be Creoles, and what did being identified as a Creole mean for the people of Kodiak Island?
So the Creoles are a really important piece of the story. The Creole in this context, which is a little bit different from other European contexts, Creole meant the children of a Russian man and a native woman. And they were identified as such in 1821 in the second charter of the Russian American Company. They had specific rights within the governmental taxonomy of different classes of peoples in the empire. Unlike any other group, they didn't have to pay taxes to the empire as long as they remained and worked on the island. And they really became the backbone of this society. They became very important. I think part of the reason I wanted to emphasize the fact that they were distinct and important in making this colony work, but also that this colony was not really completely Russian or completely native. It was really both nativized and Russianized at the same time. And that came together with these overlapping experiences of native peoples and Russians.
Now, earlier in our conversation, you've mentioned Catherine the Great a couple of times and talked about how she participated in the Enlightenment and was all for the Russian colony idea. And I now wonder if you could tell us a bit more about her ideas concerning Russia's colonies in Alaska and about native peoples like the Alutiiq.
She was interested in what was going on here. Again, this is 11 time zones away from St. Petersburg, where she's seated, right? But she was interested. She was an autocrat. She wanted to control everything. But she was also concerned about maintaining the population of this vast continental empire. And there was concern about even maintaining the Russian population of the entire empire. So she was thinking not only about ways in which to solidify this colony, because even if she wasn't paying for it initially, or even if she wouldn't take full responsibility for it, she was happy to have the fur trade company take responsibility for it. But she wanted to control what went on. And also because she's operating in the time of the Enlightenment and sees herself as a great Enlightenment thinker, and indeed she was in many ways, and she's engaged with the French philosophe, she comes to realize that this concept of hostage taking really isn't going to work, and that she wants to make sure that indigenous peoples are going to be treated with benevolence, right? That she's a benevolent autocrat. And native peoples, they were told about her, they definitely realized that Russians were distinct from them and had changed their entire way of life, but they might not necessarily have realized exactly what she represented.
How exactly did Russia govern its American colonies? You noted that Catherine was 11 time zones away in St. Petersburg and that there were fur trade companies involved. So did Russia's colonies function more like royal colonies, governed by the crown, or were they more like proprietary colonies, governed by entities like a fur trade company?
I think they were always seen as belonging to the empire, but that the fur trade would be operating them. The government doesn't actually take over until 1818 after the Napoleonic Wars. And that has a lot to do with just having resources to manage. So she was happy to have the fur trade company finance the whole thing, but they were definitely seen as part of the organization of Siberia, of the gubernia of Siberia.
You also mentioned earlier that the Russians brought or sent Russian Orthodox missionaries to North America. In fact, in 1794, I think there were something like 10 Russian Orthodox missionaries in Alaska. So what exactly was the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in the colonization of North America?
So, many components of colonial success and the smooth functioning of the colony and the minimal contentment of the fur trade employees and the religious rationale for Russian expansion required action by missionaries. So one of the things that Catherine certainly saw and that other elite Russians saw when they're thinking about, who are interested in Russian America as representing Russia to the rest of the world, which they saw was happening in the context of this fur trade, because many Europeans were coming to this area of Alaska who might never even see, certainly would not see Siberia, but who might not ever see St. Petersburg. So missionaries become really important. One of the only ways that marriage could be legitimated was within the church. So you have these native men, these promyshleniki, marrying Russian women. They want their children to be seen as legitimate within the empire, and they are religious. One of the few items that they brought with them were small icons that they had sometimes hanging around their necks. So the role of the missionaries becomes very important for the government, also for the local people. And the idea that conversion was part of imperial policy under Peter I, it included some violence where people are held at gunpoint and then baptized. But Catherine really saw conversion as a marker and a tool of civilization.
That's really interesting. And it sounds like the Russian Orthodox missionary philosophy was really similar to the active style of missionization employed by the Spanish and French Catholic missionaries, where they really went out seeking converts to their faith.
Indeed, it does seem a little bit more like Catholic missionization. And another interesting piece about this is that 1803, 1804, 1805 is the time of the first round-the-world Russian expedition. So one of the things is that some Russian leaders who end up at Kodiak and are talking about the role of the missionaries even say, look at how those Jesuits are doing things in this place, and you should be converting this way. And so there definitely is a sense among the Russian elite that this is an important piece of this system. The other thing, too, is that you might ask, well, why would Native people want to be baptized? There are multiple reasons for this, but the missionaries are continually complaining. How can they convert people when people are getting this harsh treatment from the fur trade companies, right? When they're being forced to go out and do all this work, or when some of these Russian men are acting in ways that aren't really Christian, right? And so these missionaries kind of become intermediaries in this story. Another thing to point out is the missionaries are the people who run the schools. And so one of the ideas too is Catherine is, a proponent of this, schools and educating Native children, but then the children of these mixed marriages become even more important. Educating them is a really important part of claiming the colony and demonstrating the civilization of the empire.
Now, just to further this comparison a little bit, when we look elsewhere in North America at attempts of Spanish and French missionaries to convert Native American peoples, we tend to see a lot of instances of Native American resistance. And I wonder, did the Alutiiq and other Alaskan peoples similarly resist Russian Orthodox attempts to convert them?
There doesn't seem to be a lot of resistance. What there seems to be is that people might go through the process of baptism. They might have received a piece of clothing. They might have received a book, a few gifts along with the baptism, and then not necessarily have gone to school or gone to the masses every time they were supposed to. So they might have gone through this ceremony and then they might have gone back and they might have still married more than one person within their village.
Okay, we should move a bit forward in time now. In 1799, Catherine the Great's successor, Paul I, decided to create a monopoly on the fur trade, and so he created the Russian American Company. Gwen, how did the Russian American company operate? Did it operate the fur trade any differently from the private companies that came before them?
One thing that happens, I think that Catherine was always interested in controlling this, but like I was saying, she didn't want to take financial responsibility. The idea of granting a monopoly that might inhibit so much competition and might then afford slightly better treatment indigenous people seemed to be significant. What had happened in the early 1790s when she was still alive is that expeditions had come back and reported that the treatment of the fur trade company towards native peoples was somewhat questionable. And so one of the ideas of forming the Russian American company were a board of directors, which was mainly made of merchants and nobles, with the crown also holding stock, which would be moved to St. Petersburg, could really be controlled. So this main office is now moved to St. Petersburg. It's closely related to the imperial center, closely related to the court. And so I think there's a possibility for more oversight, and also that the imperial government would gain funds directly through this. And it seems really the first step in the government takeover of the colony before that finally happens about 20 years later.
Was there any impact of this royal fur trade monopoly on Kodiak Island? I mean, did the Russian American company go into Kodiak and attempt to assert control and governance over this territory?
One of the changes when the Russian American company is formed is that there's a lot more interest in St. Petersburg about directly what's happening and the possibility that native peoples needed to be treated fairly, that Promišljeniki needed to be treated more fairly, but they're also hamstrung by the fact that they need the labor of native men in order to make the fur trade work. There's a figure, Rezanov, who's the son-in-law of Shelikov, and he is the representative of the company to the court. He actually goes to Kodiak and encourages education there and really focuses on the possibility and the role of the church there and tries to mediate a bit more the experience of peoples on the island.
So it sounds like the governance of the island became a bit more organized when the Russian American company came into being.
Yes, certainly there's more oversight. There's definitely a move towards more oversight. And also, I mean, this is really the time when there's a recognition that, again, it's going to be really difficult to get Russians to go to this place. They're concerned about hanging on to the colony. They're concerned about competition from other European powers in this area, even though it seems so remote to us. The fledgling United States, we know Lewis and Clark have just crossed the continent. The fledgling United States is looking for ways to trade when it's cut off from trade with the British for a while. And so maintaining this colony and protecting it seems to be a significant piece of the story for the empire at the beginning of the 19th century. And so they start to realize that in order to do this, they're really going to have to build a loyal population. And that means that treatment and some of the peoples will have to be a little bit different, but also that they're going to have to find a population that will be willing to stay in this area and also be loyal and knowledgeable.
Now, you mentioned that 20 years after the establishment of the Russian American company, the Russian government would decide to take complete control of the fur trade in Alaska. Would you tell us how that happened and what happened to the governance of colonial Alaska?
I think the move to a monopoly was kind of a first step in this. I think there was growing interest in the 19th century that this was a place where people from France and England and the new US were coming and would see this would be a stage for the Russian Empire, and that the government better, be able to oversee very closely what was going on here. But another important piece too is, again, it's after the Napoleonic Wars where some military personnel are available to oversee it. But another important piece too is that as round the world expeditions grow, as different Europeans are observing Russian behavior here, they are commenting, even the English will say, oh, we came upon a whole flotilla of people hunting and we realized that they were already owned by the Russians. And so all of these other Europeans, perhaps in an effort to make themselves look benevolent in the eyes of others or in the eyes of their leadership, they often wrote about how harsh the Russians were. And there was a lot of anxiety among the Russian elite at this time about proving Europeanness. So this was seen as a stage for proving Europeanness.
So what did Russian imperial rule mean for Alaska and the people of Kodiak Island?
I think for the people who lived on Kodiak Island, there was perhaps some more attention to what was going on. So maybe they received a little bit better treatment during this time. There were more resources available. So there was more interest in supplying the colony. So there was trade with other areas, for instance, interest in trade with the Spanish. So there was more attention to supplying the colony fully so that people could survive in a slightly more easier fashion.
So how does the story of Russian America play out and come to an end? Because we know that the Russians don't stay as a colonial presence in North America. So how and when did their period of colonization end?
It becomes mostly that it's very expensive for Russia to keep this colony going. There aren't a lot of people who are interested in staying there. Yes, there is a Creole population that's really at the center of things that has sustained the colony. But the U.S. has expanded quite a bit by the 1860s, and it offers Russia payment for this area, and the Russian government agrees to relinquish it.
Gwen, this has been a really interesting conversation. And before we move into the time warp, I wonder if you would give us your take on why you think it's important for us to study and think about Russian America and really see it as part of our larger story of early American history.
Well, I think it based the idea that America was international before it was national, that there were multiple meanings of the term European and Native America comes out of looking at this story. I think it forces us to reconsider the idea that the English would prevail throughout the continent. I think obviously locally, this is the history of, what was going on in this one area for 100 years. But another thing too is that even when Americans became involved in the China trade, they come to this area and it's already completely shaped by this Russian trade for a whole generation. So I think that's part of it. And one of the important things to me in thinking about this too is that I think some of the things that we don't think about so much, this is an unfamiliar terrain that can expose the ways in which violence, independence, and coercion and compromise acted together. And that, maybe we can think about the way those types of things happened in regions that we're more familiar with on the East Coast.
Now let's move into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Gwen, how might our understanding of early American history be different if we followed the history of the United States from west to east instead of from east to west?
Well, I think one of the things is that, like I said before, we might have a better sense of the idea that America was international, and not just from the perspective of Europeans, but it was international from the beginning in so many different ways. The idea of manifest destiny, of Europeans' right to the land, would probably be very different, would probably not exist in the same way. But I think the idea that native empires from the Mandan to the Comanche to the Powhatan to the Mayan, etc., existed before or alongside the emergence of European empires. And, as we know, they were as different from one another as Europeans were. And we could know much more about the variety of ways in which they encountered Europeans, and that there was a great complexity of trade relations that existed before Europeans ever arrived. And there would be really no indication that the English and even the U.S. in the 1780s would come to dominate the continent. So I think it would really disrupt our national narrative.
So Gwen, are you still studying aspects of Russian American history, or are you investigating something different?
I'm studying a story that I came upon in the context of this, but what I'm looking at is Boston's involvement in the opium trade, largely in the same era. But I'm working on a biography of John Perkins Cushing, who was a Bostonian who went to Canton for some 25 years and really became the center of Boston's involvement in the opium trade there, and looking at it as a transnational history of the growth of Boston.
Now, I know ours has been a whirlwind tour of Russian America. So if we have more questions about this aspect of history or the history of Kodiak Island, how can we contact you?
Probably the best way is just through the Holy Cross history website, or just by emailing me at gmiller@holycross.edu.
Gwen Miller, thank you so much for introducing us to Alutiiq and Russian American history.
Thank you, Liz. It's been a pleasure.
The story of Russian America is all about the fur trade. The trade and demand for furs in Europe and China pushed Russian traders and colonists east from the Eurasian continent into North America. Now, the Russians were relative latecomers in terms of European empires in North America. They officially colonized Alaska in 1784, the year after the Treaty of Paris saw Great Britain relinquish control of 13 of its North American colonies. But like Great Britain, Russia was a global empire. It had colonies that stretched across 11 different time zones, and across the Eurasian continent with some colonies in North America. It also had an active trade with China, Europe, and the Americas. Now, the main staple of its trade was furs. Russia had a large-scale fur trading operation that functioned quite differently. Before 1791, private fur trading companies dominated the Russian trade in furs. They operated largely by kidnapping indigenous hunters and forcing them to hunt for furs for their freedom. As Gwen revealed, this was a system that greatly impacted the Alutiiq people of Kodiak Island and the peoples of the Aleutian Islands before them. This was because Alutiiq societies relied on a gendered division of labor, and when Russian traders kidnapped Alutiiq men and took them far away from their villages, they really disrupted the Alutiiq's way of life and their ability to provide for their families. Now, both Catherine the Great and her successor Paul I sought to change how the Russian fur trade operated in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Both monarchs believed that the Russians' current system of kidnapping indigenous hunters really worked against the principles of the Enlightenment and also led other European countries to charge the Russians with a backward scheme of colonization. This was a characterization the Russians really wanted to avoid, as Russia wanted to be seen as a civilized, benevolent, and sophisticated global empire. But governing Alaska and overseeing a colony so far removed from St. Petersburg was difficult. And by the 1860s, times had changed. The fur trade wasn't nearly as lucrative as it had been. Few Russians wanted to relocate to Alaska, and there weren't really Europeans in North America anymore. Plus, the United States was pushing its territorial claims further and further west. So in 1867, Russia decided to simplify things, and it accepted the United States' offer to purchase its territorial claims to Alaska for $7.2 million, or roughly $123 million today. Now, the history of Russian America allows us to see a different history of colonial America from the one we normally study. By looking west to east, we can see a different international dimension of colonial American history. The fact that there were multiple meanings of European and Native American, and how dynamics of trade and power played out in different cultural and geographic contexts. Look for more information about Gwen, her book, Kodiak Creole, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/233. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you really enjoy Ben Franklin's World, I'd be grateful if you'd tell your friends and family about it. Don't forget that you can now display your Ben Franklin's World pride because we have t-shirts. That's right. Take a look at our first designs by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/shop. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's Digital Projects team. Joseph Edelman, Kim Foley, Martha Howard, Emily Steff, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, what other aspects of Russian America or early American history would you like to explore? Your suggestions always inform episodes of this podcast, so please let me know what you'd like to investigate. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.